thank you for joining me. I'm Kevin Ford, the filmmaker of The Pushback, and this conversation is just inspired by The Pushback. So, of course, we have Councilwoman Natasha Harper Madison here with us, who's in the film, and Mayor Steve Adler, who recently saw the film, was at our premiere in Austin, Texas. And let's just kick it off there because that's an organic place to start. You guys were both there. I couldn't be there. You know, it was a COVID-safe way to kick this film off and share it with the community. And I'm curious from both of your perspectives, you know, how that was being there and seeing the film with the community and what you took away from that.
I will just say, having the opportunity to reach out to one of my colleagues who has very quickly become a friend, and by way of my daughter's perspective, Mr. Steve, they love him, and rightfully so. He's been a fantastic colleague and a wonderful person, just generally to be around and to have introduced me to this strange new world. You'll see in the film that, you know, you were following me around when I was campaigning. I was entirely new, entirely green. When I was able to ask him, it would be really great for me if you were to be there for the premiere. And there wasn't any hesitation on his part and on his wife, Diane, on her part to be there in support of and, you know, just being present for the experience. I got to tell you, I mean, in addition to my family and my friends that were there, it really meant a lot that they came. I'm really grateful that my colleague and now friend, Mayor Steve Adler, and his wife, Diane, were there to be a part of this experience. It was fantastic. It was frightening. It was, you know, it was weird. You know, my mom was there, my kids were there, my husband, you know, and having them all sort of look over at me like, you're in a movie about politics. You know, how do we even get here? I think we're all sort of adjusting for what it's worth.
Mayor Adler, from your experience, you know, it's been such a tough year with Austin. As you know, our film was set to premiere at South by Southwest. So many things this year have been canceled and derailed. Was there any sense for you just coming out to participate, be there to see our film? I just wonder from your perspective what that was like.
The decision to cancel South by was the most horrific that I've been involved in. Just because you knew how disrupting that was going to be to so many people's lives. But yet watching and talking with mayors around the world and watching this virus as it moved across the world and was this then hitting Seattle and knowing that we were going to have between 5,000 and 10,000 people from Seattle arriving in our city within the next week. We had no choice, but that makes it no less horrific. So driving out to see the documentary, knowing that it, among others, was supposed to premiere there, it was sad. At the same time, this was the first movie that I've seen outside of my home now since March. And to see a movie in this kind of new middle of the pandemic environment where I'm at a drive-in movie theater, and it's been a while since I've done that, but everybody was able to be there safely and still be able to see the movie. And there was a sense of community, even among the people that were there, even though we were in the cars, not like being with each other and rubbing elbows, but even still, there was people that were coming back out again. And I know that there were people at that film that really hadn't ventured out before much, but it was important, that film, that moment, and to honor, you know, my colleague on the council. I'm such a fan and groupie of Councilmember Harper-Madison that I couldn't imagine a premiere without Diane and me being there. The freshness and perspective that she brought into this race with the knowledge and the insight that the voters saw, which is, I think, why she was elected. This was not a naive outsider. This was not a politician, but this was somebody who really was the right person at the right time, having the right background and lived experiences and breadth of knowledge and attributes. And you could see that. I love the documentary. I mean, the documentary itself really focused on change. It focused on newness. It focused on forks in the road. It focused on potential and aspiration. But it was also real. There was nothing that was candy coated about it, and in fact, Councilmember Harper-Madison obviously won her election, but Beto lost his, and the movie dealt with both. But that's what life is. But the spark that you caught, the sense of change, and the new optimism, quite frankly, the new expectation for how things must change that you captured in that documentary now is blooming a little bit more as it progresses in the election that we're in the middle of right now. And it's in the context of the election that we're in the middle of right now that we watched this documentary, because it was fresh to us as it related back. The fact that 97% of people in Travis County have registered to vote is an element of the essence of what you caught in that documentary. The fact that early vote here that just happened 4 days ago set new records. And then the second night of voting broke the records of the first night. And the third night broke the records of the second, breaking the first. And last night on Friday, it broke the records of Thursday, which broke the records of Wednesday, which broke the records of Tuesday. And you sense that there are more people now recognizing that yes, despite the urban myth, your vote does make a difference when we have a president who's only in that office swinging 2 votes per precinct. In the last state that he won to put him over the top, 2 votes per precinct. If they changed, he would not be president that we have today. Your vote matters. And then the other canard that I just don't like the system. Well, I think people now realize that if you don't like the system, then it's on you to change it. And that means walking in the street. But more than anything else, it means voting. And I think people are understanding that. That's why in Austin right now, in the first early vote, 28% of the people voting are under 30. 40% of the people voting here in these early days under 40. That's unprecedented. It is an election we're having right now where 30% of the people thus far that have voted, we have no evidence they've ever voted in a general election before. I am so excited at this moment in what's going on. I am scared and nervous and anxious and excited. And that's what I thought you presented in that documentary. And that's why it was so timely and I enjoyed it so much, other than just being a groupie of one of its stars.
For folks that haven't seen the film, can you just talk about a little bit about your backstory, what led you into this? Because you were not necessarily on a trajectory for politics, but I think that's one of the things that's most inspiring. You physically showed up and are literally changing the democracy, and that's how the system can be.
I think I'll start by just sort of echoing, the physical part of it, right? Because for all intents and purposes, that's exactly where this started. This started with me having a physical reaction. I got cancer. One of my former opponents, now good friend, his name is Louis Conway Jr. He had a similar experience and he called it his health opportunity. And he allowed me the opportunity to steal that from him. I call it my health opportunity. My health opportunity presented itself in 2014 when I thought, my path was clear. I thought in terms of trajectory, I was moving exactly the direction that I thought I was going to go. I, as a person who grew up, whose formative experience was, deeply entrenched in poverty, I thought often about how I would make a shift, not just for myself, but for people like me. And so I figured out my why. My why was to transcend cyclical poverty. And I talk about that briefly in the film. But my how, I thought my how was, I was gonna get rich. I was gonna make a lot of money, and I was gonna engage in some really robust, like ridiculous philanthropy. I remember very distinctly saying, I'm gonna make a lot of money and I'm gonna give it all away. That was my plan. That was my goal. And I fought through all the layers of the difficulty that is entrepreneurship, figuring it out, not having, that path clearly defined for me either. I figured it out. I asked questions and I engaged in, really sort of burying my head in entrepreneurship. And I was pitching and I was trying to sell businesses. And I finally had one that people were interested in. And so I thought I'd sell this business. And so sure enough, after a really fantastic pitch, apparently somebody was interested in the business and was wanting to, put some money behind the business. And so we were slated to execute this particular business on a certain day in September 2014. And then, I had this health opportunity where there was a series of things that were happening with my body that were abnormal. My husband's a firefighter and paramedic, and he told me, if that happens again, you have to go have somebody check it out. And so it happened again. So I had to go get it checked out. And sure enough, that week I found out, the beginning of the week I had lupus, the end of the week I had cancer. And it was a fast growing late stage cancer. And I was 36 years old. So having the opportunity to really question my mortality at 36 really shifted my trajectory. It really offered me the opportunity to say, if I'm having to think about this, if I have to get my affairs in order, if I have to talk to my kids about me potentially not being here, then what do I want to spend my last days doing? And it really gave me the clarity that I needed around just having something that was more substantive, that was more fruitful, that was, going to be the opportunity to leave a legacy that I could be proud of for my children. And that was community advocacy, which I'll tell you, nobody's mad at you when you're a community advocate. When you're helping people in a way that's all advocacy and you're just fighting for them nonstop, which is not so unlike, a career in municipal politics. But there's a very distinct difference in how people receive you between the two. So nobody was mad at me when I was a community advocate. Nobody ever cussed me out or called me nasty names or, that never happened. And so I did that. And then in the course of doing that, to some degree, I recognized that there were some things that I just couldn't shift as a community advocate. And I realized that the way to make these shifts was going to be by way of shifting municipal policy. And I'm a person who thinks big, I dream big, I go big. And I said, well, I'm going to run for public office. I'm just going to do it. And, I didn't do enough in the way of research. So for all intents and purposes, I ran my campaign for that first several months in all the naive, misguided ways. But I finally found my footing and I found some guidance and support in people who believed in, my thought that representation matters and that regular people should run for office. You shouldn't be a person who's been born and bred for politics and groomed for it your whole life. Regular people should do this job. Now, on the other end of it, now that I see behind the curtain, I absolutely recognize why regular people don't do it. It's virtually impossible for several reasons. Unless you're independently wealthy, it's difficult to find yourself in a position where you have the financial runway to do it and the ability to raise enough money to do it. You think about raising money and you think statewide races or federal races, but even at the municipal level, you have to be able to raise money, which was not something that I was prepared to do. I eventually figured it out. Obviously, here I am, but you found me on the campaign trail. When we were introduced, it was on the campaign trail. I wasn't able to work during that time. So when I talk about this financial runway component, you have to be able to take a year off and run for office and make it your full-time job. I slept at that campaign office. I was working 18, 19 hours a day to win the opportunity to get people's trust in me to do this job. And if you can't take off work to do that, then you can't do it. And so I think in a lot of ways, I recognized during the course of pursuing this path, by design, it's not for regular people. It's not for people who don't have the security of independent wealth. So that just made me want to push harder and fight harder to find my footing and to win the spot and to win the trust of my potential constituents to represent them. One of my primary goals in this role is capacity building. I really look forward to being able to candidly share with other people, regular people who could do this job easily with the appropriate amount of support, the things that I learned along the way.
Mayor Adler, can you talk a little bit about your own personal history before becoming mayor and how that has led to the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, I was actually born and raised in Washington, D.C. Not too many of us were. So I grew up in a community where your local news was the international news. My father was a film editor for CBS and worked on the nightly news. So I grew up on the CBS newsroom floor, and that probably also kind of activated in me a desire, a knowledge and an awareness of what was happening, and the ability of people to be able to impact that, and how there are issues of justice that are in the balance every day somewhere. When I became a lawyer, I started out as a civil rights lawyer. I was representing workers in cases that were facing discrimination, women that were facing harassment in the workplace environment. And that's how I cut my teeth and did my first litigation in those settings. Later on, I represented property owners whose land was being taken by the government, which raised constitutional issues, also I think equity issues in many of the cases, including some of the one that you highlighted with the border wall, which is just an outrageous thing to be taking property for because it doesn't work. But beyond that, just the way that it's happening, and you can see farmers that were otherwise being taken advantage of. Not really understanding the full weight of the tools available to them that the law provides. So going to what Natasha was talking about a second ago in terms of capacity, the law can build all kinds of tools and safeguards into the system, but if people don't know about them, if they don't have access to them, if they're not apparent and readily available, then they don't count. Because they're not serving the purpose they were designed to do. So I was doing all this in the kind of the private sector world. One of my close friends got elected to the state Senate in Texas. That was my first trip inside any kind of legislative place. I took off from the law practice to help him set up his office. He was a great senator, probably the most progressive senator in the Texas Senate. He was kind of the conscience of the Senate. And again, it was apparent the disconnect for so many people, that disconnect between what was available and what they could reach, as well as real stark lines between what really is not available, regardless, because of the systemic barriers that we've allowed to pervade everything that is part of our institutions. And it became apparent to me that if you really want to impact that stuff in a way that people can feel immediately, it's city government, it's local government. It's the government that's closest to the people because it can be most responsive. There's something nice too about a local city government that's not partisan. It is all based on policy, and while sometimes those policies divide up in a partisan way, it really is about getting the work done. So I ran for city council as mayor, not having ever run for anything before, in part like Natasha, because I had no clue as to what it really meant to be mayor or what it meant to run for mayor, but recognizing that in that milieu somewhere would be the tools to be able to impact people's lives and to change institutions, which is why it was great to see Natasha running, kind of like the cavalry coming over the hill with some of the new council members that were arriving, that really has given us the voting power on the council to be able to do wonderful things in terms of minimum wages, on second chance hiring, on on universal health care, that it's still something that is perceived to be out of reach by too many people, and the way that we set up elections exacerbate that. But I see that as among the things that are in our to-do list to start pushing back against.
One of the things I learned as the filmmaker of this is no matter who I was filming, the people that I was focusing on in the film are usually coming from a very positive place of activism, volunteerism, very patriotic people. How do you kind of maintain a positivity? What is your compass that keeps you going? Because to do your job right, in my opinion, you have to follow your own heart and your own mind and do what you're trying to do, knowing you cannot please everyone.
I mean, at the risk of it sounding extraordinarily cliche, we got to do it for the kids. I started this conversation out by talking about my daughter just being a fangirl of Mrs. Steve, because she, in her own 10-year-old way, she recognizes the difficulty of the job that he has to do. And so I think for her to have somebody in the position he's in take the time to go low when he talks to her, he doesn't stand above her. He makes certain to take the effort and the opportunity to go to her eye level and talk directly to her, not talk at her, not talk around her, talk to her. I think people disregard the relevance of the intellect and the power of perception that children have. They see everything we do. They hear everything. And so I thought maybe it was to my detriment at the time. Early on, I tried to encourage people to be mindful about that, the fact that our children are watching us. And we have to provide a better example than name calling and sort of just generally nasty and arbitrary positions that we take with one another, especially when we take the opportunity to really, really talk to one another so frequently. What it is that we hope to accomplish is the same. We might be saying it differently. We might be approaching it from a different ideological lens. But oftentimes, what we're saying is the same. Our goal is the same. We just need to sort of step outside of ourselves and our ego and our attachment to partisan affiliation and ideological commitment, and just say, I think what we're saying is the same thing. What we hope to achieve is the same thing. And so I oftentimes try to look at it from the perspective of a child who hasn't had to pick a side yet. As far as they're concerned, it's much like, how you would describe somebody who is considered a moderate, somebody who's in the middle, who for them, what's important is smart policy that affects people's lives positively. And it doesn't matter if there's an R or a D or a C or an I or whatever letter next to your name. People in the middle, there's a politician in Austin, or out of Austin rather, Mr. Hightower. He's got this famous expression that I've been taking along with me. I don't know if he knows it, but he says, the only thing in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead armadillos. The truth of the matter is, I really just try to find myself as close to the middle of the road so that I'm not blinded by or deaf to the contributions from people who don't see the world exactly like I do. And I think very much that's how children see it. And, I encourage people very early on to remember that our children are watching us and what kind of example are we presenting for them. So that's been my guiding light. And I really appreciate that they've offered me that opportunity to, one, see the world from their perspective, but two, also be granted the opportunity to recognize that the things that I do and say, they will see. And even when they're adults, and, God willing, I'll be a grandmother one day and my grandbabies will see and other people's children will see. I want to be a positive example for them. And that is, for me personally, been a really fantastic guide.
Well, I love Natasha's answer, and you can see why I'm such a groupie and fan. But your question was, look at the divisiveness that currently exists, and how do we navigate that with the vitriol being so extreme, because it's a concern, and I think it's a real threat to democracy. If we get to the place where we can't talk to one another, where we can't sit down and recognize any validity that might exist in the other's argument, if we can't work together to find solutions that are better than the ones that we know of ourselves, if we can't get past the ego involved in thinking that each of us is the smartest person in the room, then we're in trouble. And that's not how our country and democracy need to be working going forward. I will say, to start off with, that I read very little of the comments on social media. Something horrible happens to many people when they start commenting on things on social media, where they start treating people as if they're no longer human. And there's such license, I think, that people feel like they have alone in their rooms, sitting at their keyboard, that they can say things and that they would never say in person to someone, or they would never say directly to someone, or say out loud in a group somewhere. Something very, very unfortunate happens with the license and oftentimes the anonymity that comes with social media. I am constantly amazed at the shared values, the shared desire for similar outcomes, what we have in common with one another, and I know it's trite to say, so far outweighs what we do not have in common. There is truly an American spirit and ideal about freedom and about liberty. And good is a healthy argument to talk about freedom from being sick. Is that a freedom too? I think it is. Freedom to health care, the rights. We can have those conversations, but all within the context of recognizing that this country guarantees more freedoms and more access and more opportunities for positive change. When you can actually sit down with a person, there's such opportunity and potential. We just have to clear through all the other stuff. And to me, that's what this election is about. This election, I think, in very important terms, is about when I sit down with somebody, is my first question, am I on this person's side? Or am I sitting down with a person and wanting to know, where does this person come from? And to me, that is how I would describe this election. And the beginnings of that, I think, is what you saw. I believe I represent this entire city, and the views are real disparate in this city, but the values and the ultimate goals and objectives are so commonly held.
But Natasha, I just wanted to get a final kind of button from you, because you're always inspiring to me, and I think to a lot of other people. If there's someone that catches this who's thinking, I don't need to vote, it's not going to change anything, what would you just say right now to inspire someone who maybe is on the fence about participating in our democracy?
So the long answer is, I'm sitting in my car, I'm listening to NPR, and I hear the person who's presenting this story. They said, low information voter quotient. I heard it, and then I heard it again, and then I heard it again. Throughout the course of this broadcast, they said it 3 times, and it made me uncomfortable. And so my mom's famous for her quotes, right? And so one of the things that she used to say was, baby girl, if somebody says something and it makes you feel a way, it's probably because it's about you. And so then I had to ask myself, am I a low information voter? So as a person who was emancipated before my 18th birthday, I had the opportunity to be, sort of quote unquote on my own for a couple of years before I was technically an adult. And so I was trying to navigate the terrain that is the lived environment of adults as a person who was not technically an adult yet. So there was a lot that I was learning. But during the course of that, so many people that I'd encountered along the way just spoke so highly about the importance of civic participation, voting, and so I knew when I turned 18, that was going to be something I did, now how I did it, nobody actually offered me a playbook for that. I was just making it up as I went, and I thought to myself, am I a low information voter? And it turns out I absolutely was, and I could name the 5 things, like it was like, I voted for the Black person. I voted for the woman. I voted for the Latinx person. I voted for the name I recognized. It was like, there were a list of sort of parameters under which I voted, but none of them made me a highly informed voter. I wasn't looking at the key issue positions that these people were presenting or their voting history or, like the things that you really should take into consideration when you decide to cast that ballot and vote for a person. And so I decided in that moment, I was going to make myself a highly informed voter. I got a League of Women's Voters voter information guide, and then I got a sample ballot and I tried to go through and, I'd heard rhetorically, I had heard people talk about the importance of making certain to get down the ballot. But then you get down the ballot and then some of these judicial races and who the heck knows what the railroad commissioner does. I certainly thought it was about trains, but once I recognized that it was not at all about trains, it was about oil and gas, which, I'm in Texas. That's a big office. It's really important. But these are the kind of things that unless you have somebody who's teaching you, coaching you, training you, you just don't know. And so I recognized in that instance that I was an underinformed voter. And so are most people, frankly. And you sound, relatively pompous. There's an air of condescension when you try to tell people to be more informed when they make these decisions. So you can only really invest in yourself in that moment. But as you learn, it's what's that expression about each one teach one. So as I learned, I tried to bring people along with me and let them know there are resources available to you. You don't have to take my cheat sheet and do what I did, but these are the ways that you can become highly informed and vote and participate in a way that you're actually doing something that's substantive as opposed to just, adhering to the status quo, what the ubiquitous they expect you to do. That for me felt empowering. And it made me want to sort of trudge through and push forward and be a part of this system, be a substantive part of this system that for so many people by design, they're excluded. And so for me, that was really kind of the lead in. And I'd say, takeaways from there would be and I hate to tell people what to do, but I would say if somebody were asking me for advice, I would say, don't listen to the masses. Let your heart and your gut and your instincts be your guide. You will do the right thing for yourself, for your family, for the community that you aspire to advocate for. Let your instincts be your guide and take the opportunity to access the information that's really, frankly, readily available. There are, like Vote 411. You can go in, you enter your address, and you can create what they call a sample ballot, right? The sample ballot will tell you by way of your address and your polling location, these are the specific items that are going to be on the ballot that you get to vote for. And then you get to, make the determination for yourself and for what's important to you and your family and your community, who you want to vote for. You don't have to just, randomly choose. It's not the Scantron where you bubble in just guessing. You really get to actively be a part of this process. And I'll leave it with this. I didn't know that I had the opportunity to be a patriot. I think there was a part of me that assumed because of my race and my gender that I was relegated to a certain sort of expectation around how I participate. I assumed that because of racism, hundreds of years of it, and the transatlantic slave trade, that because my people didn't come here by choice, even though we've been here for hundreds of years and multiple series of generations, that I couldn't be a patriot. But it turns out I absolutely am. And that doesn't mean, I'm riding on the back of a, dually pickup truck wrapped in an American flag with a bald eagle sitting on my shoulder. It means I believe in our republic and our ability to represent for every person who lives here, regardless of their immigration status or any other point of consideration. I believe in this republic to finally get it right. I believe that we have done so many things wrong, but we have found ourselves in a position to get things right and address the wrongs and reconcile and atone and have everybody feel like this is our country. I am, in fact, a patriot. This is my country. This is where I was born. My mother was born, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my great-great-grandmother. My family has been here long enough for this to be our country too. I get to be a patriot. And in the ownership of that for me means that I don't have any choice but to participate. I don't have any choice but to atone for the sins of our past and make this country the best it can possibly be. It feels equal parts obligation and privilege. And I wholeheartedly dive in head first in the opportunity to make this a place where we all get to live and thrive and function in a way that we recognize the work has to be done. And as we do it, we don't have to rip one another to shreds to get it done. And that more or less is my guide. I believe in that wholeheartedly. And there are certainly some folks who will call me naive and call me a dreamer. But I think there's a Beatles song that talks about being a dreamer. I won't sing to y'all because I don't do it well, but they can call me a dreamer. But I 100% believe that my path forward is clearly defined by my guides, by my ancestors, and by my passion for my patriotic commitment to making this country the best it can be.
Well, a lot of that, it's interesting. That's what I tried to do with my team in the pushback, was to say, okay, you can't spend time with all these people, but if I could kind of edit it and present it in a certain way, viewers might actually see behind some sound bites and some news headlines and get an actual feel for the different people. And in that, maybe come away with a different view of Texas. And so on that note, the film is now available. If you go to our website, thepushbackfilm.com. Thank you both so much for doing this.
Thank you.